Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
How good of you to join us again this week for another lesson in the Word. We're exploring some Old Testament passages that focus on a wonderful and important topic, the faithfulness of God. And we see the faithfulness of God in a number of Old Testament passages, especially in contrast to the faithlessness, or at least struggles, of God's covenant people, the Israelites. We continue this week in a follow-up lesson to our study last time in Numbers chapters 13 and 14, and we continue that story of kind of a difficult time in the experience of the Israelites, but God's faithfulness is seen in those difficulties.
Yes.
Dr. Blackburn's back with us. Welcome, Barry.
It's good to be here.
Good. Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us this week. It's a pleasure to have you. Now, last week, Dr. Roberts and I explored the verses that immediately precede what we're going to be talking about today. We discovered that the Israelites had reached the southern border of Canaan, the promised land. And it took them only about 2 years to get there, which is fairly efficient for traveling through the Sinai Peninsula. But here they hit a roadblock. And the roadblock isn't really the opposition of the Canaanite people, and it certainly isn't the will of God, and it isn't the leadership of Moses. It's the recalcitrance of the Israelite people themselves.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of a sad moment.
Lack of confidence that God will carry them forward like he has in the past.
Yeah, lack of confidence that God would keep his promises.
Right.
And I'm afraid that I am subject to that same problem at times in my own life. So they've reached the border of the southern border of the promised land. Moses and the people and God seem all to agree that a reconnaissance mission is called for.
Right.
And to check out two things. One is agricultural productivity. Can it support 1 million or 2 million people? We don't know exactly how many Israelites there were. And the other part is military. What kind of opposition are they going to meet? How many people? How militarized they are? How well fortified their cities are?
Right.
And they come back with kind of a mixed report. Mixed in two ways. One, good on the agricultural side, not so good on the military side.
Right.
And then it's also mixed in that out of the 12 scouts, 10 agree that there's no way that they can fight their way into the land. And 2 say, well, it's worth it because it's agriculturally productive, and with God's help we can do it.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a mixed report.
Yeah.
And the people follow the negative.
Yeah.
They definitely follow the negative. So the last words we read in last week's lesson were the people prepared to stone their leaders. I guess that included Joshua and Caleb and Moses and Aaron and anybody else who thought they ought to go into the promised land. Well, that brings us to our lesson today. It was kind of a negative moment. What's interesting is that the last thing we saw was the people about to stone Moses.
Right.
And in this lesson, we're going to see Moses fulfilling an interesting role in behalf of those people.
Yes, absolutely. We see him as the great intercessor.
Yeah, in behalf of them. So there's going to be a fascinating turnaround as we go. Well, I believe it's my turn to read, so let me read our text today. We're going to take up our reading in the middle of chapter 10 of verse 14. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs I've performed among them? I'll strike them down with a plague and destroy them, but I'll make you into a nation greater and stronger than they." Moses said to the Lord, "Then the Egyptians will hear about it. By your power you brought these people up from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of this land about it. They've already heard that you, Lord, are with these people, and that you, Lord, have been seen face to face, that your cloud stays over them, and that you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. If you put all these people to death, leaving none alive, the nations who have heard this report about you will say, 'The Lord wasn't able to bring these people into the land he promised them on oath, so he slaughtered them in the wilderness.' Now may the Lord's strength be displayed, just as you have declared. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of this people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now." The Lord replied, "I have forgiven them, as you asked." Well, there's Moses, the great intercessor.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, in spite of the dire threat of stoning with which verse 10 begins, we have the glory of the Lord breaking forth in the latter part of the verse.
Right.
What should we, how should we understand this phrase, the glory of the Lord? Help us out with that.
Well, the word glory, as we discussed earlier, has to do with weight or heaviness. So it's something that makes a great impression on other people. And it's kind of difficult in these passages. It's the glory of the Lord is obviously associated with the cloud and with the fire. Exactly what that relationship is not entirely clear. Is the cloud itself an expression of the glory of the Lord, or is there perhaps more? I have a passage from Exodus chapter 24 that I think is interesting in this regard. It says that Moses went up on the mountain, Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered the mountain. And the glory of the Lord, there's our phrase, settled on Mount Sinai. And the cloud covered it for 6 days, and on the seventh day he called to Moses out of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. So that suggests the possibility that perhaps the glory of the Lord is something that appears almost like fire within the cloud. So it's not entirely clear. Either way, whether it's the cloud or something within the cloud, it's a very impressive expression of God's presence.
Yeah, and I think ultimately we can settle on that certainty,
right,
that the suggestion here is that God is present with his people in a powerful and impactful way. How that's visually expressed is subject to a little ambiguity there. But, it's associated with the cloud, with the fire, and the glory of the Lord appeared here. Now, this cloud frequently kind of settles over the tent of meeting, which is the tabernacle from Sinai, right?
Right, exactly.
So this was a place of worship, and that seems to be the locus in the center of the camp where this cloud appeared. Now, we've noticed many times that the Israelites complained to Moses and about Moses, which is kind of like complaining about God's leadership. Here, the Lord complains to Moses about the people, right?
Yes, exactly.
In verse 11. So what's this complaint? How long will these people treat me with contempt? The word implies scorn or despite or even a kind of an abhorrence. It's a pretty strong word. And then how long will they refuse to believe in me, I who did so many signs among them.
Right. I think it's interesting. How long will they refuse to believe in me? Here, it's not a matter of whether they believe that Yahweh exists.
Right.
It's not that. It's whether they believe that He can do what they need, which is to give them these military victories. So it's a failure of trust.
Yeah.
It's a lack of confidence.
Not a failure of faith as such.
Right.
And the Hebrew word that's translated here, believe, actually more literally means support, which I think bears out what you're saying. It's not that they're trying to decide whether to believe in the existence of God or not.
Right.
But are they going to stick with God's plan in trust and faith? That's interesting. You would also notice that these words are echoed by words of kind of sad exasperation by Jesus later on.
Exactly.
What was that circumstance?
Well, I'm sure you remember the story of Jesus encountering it's right after the Transfiguration. Jesus comes down from the mountain and he finds a discussion going on between his disciples and a man who has brought his epileptic son to Jesus. And he tells Jesus that he brought him to his disciples and they weren't able to cast the demon out of him. And it was at that point that Jesus utters words of exasperation, just about like this, which is interesting, partly because of what it says about Jesus, that he feels comfortable in appropriating words spoken by God and speaking them for himself.
Yeah. You know, the other interesting parallel there is with that statement, we were not able, because the ability of various people is raised in this passage in Numbers.
Yes.
We're going to see it again in a minute, but we already saw it in the last lesson where Caleb says, we can do this.
Right.
We are able.
Right.
And the people contradict him and say, no, we're not able. And we'll see if God is able later on. Yeah, I think that's a fascinating parallel that you point out there in the ministry of Jesus. Well, out of this exasperation comes a resolution by God in verse 12. I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them. That's pretty strong language there. Yes. God has punished the Israelites throughout their relatively short wilderness journey so far. There's been a fire in the camp. There was a plague related to the quail, things like that. But this threat by God is really quite dramatic.
It's an escalation for sure.
It is. The word destroy in the NIV is translated differently in other English translations, I believe, right?
Yes, in the New Revised Standard Version, it's disinherit.
Yeah, which I think is very interesting because we think of the Israelite people as the chosen people of God.
Right.
He's given them a special bequest. Now, it's in behalf of other humans, but it is their special bequest. And so if they're not going to act in covenant with God, then God is prepared to disinherit them, kind of to unchoose them, as it were.
Right.
But it is clear that Moses takes pretty seriously this threat to literally destroy the people. His words are going to imply that he thinks the slaughter of the Israelite people is a divine possibility. And
it's interesting that if God were to do this, it would still not be a failure reneging on his promise to Abraham, since Moses was a descendant of Abraham.
Yeah.
But even so, Moses won't have it.
Yeah. The role of Moses in this is quite fascinating. We're talking here about the last clause of verse 12, where it says that he'll destroy the bulk of the people, and I will make you, that's Moses, right?
Right.
Into a nation greater and stronger than they've ever been.
Right.
And that was your point in saying that that God seems to be suggesting that he chose Moses as the Abrahamic descendant
Right.
who will become the focal point of the covenant people.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
Now, some commentators have suggested that this would have felt like a real temptation to Moses to see himself, he's already the leader of the people, but this would kind of elevate him into an Abraham-like role as the father of the nation, kind of the second Abraham, or the chosen descendant of Abraham, and that these words in verse 12 may actually have been a God's test of Moses to see if he cared more about his own role in the covenant process than he cared about the people and their role in the covenant process. I don't think we have any way of knowing if it's intended as a test.
But, you know, the fact of the matter is that the story does show that Moses was concerned about the people, and he certainly did not, you know, choose himself, but you know, chose the people.
So if it is a test, he appears to have passed the test.
He passed it. That's right.
Well, good. That's good. Now, Moses' first response to this divine threat of near annihilation isn't intercession for the people. He's worried about the reputation of God. And for better or worse, that's his first response. How does he express his fears there?
Yeah, he appeals to God to consider the result of destroying his people. The result will be that the other nations will chalk it up to the Lord's inability to pull off what he promised that he would pull off. So it would be a detract from his glory and from his reputation.
Yeah. I think there's another factor here as well. It's important to remember that God's work among the Israelite people in Egypt, including the plagues, always had as its goal the revelation of God's person and will to the Egyptian people. The plague, in the stories of the plague, it's frequently stated, and so they will know that I am the Lord. So the word evangelistic may be too strong here, but there's an almost evangelistic goal to God's dealings with Israel in Egypt, including the plagues, reaching out. And so it is that such a dire destruction would harm let's say, potentially the reputation of God among these unbelieving nations. But there's also a sense in which it would forestall any attempt to reach out to the other nations and encourage faith in Yahweh.
It would certainly not make Israel's God attractive to them.
Yeah. So that's another fascinating component.
Especially in the ancient world, a God's reputation was based on whether they were able to accomplish things and do things.
Yeah.
And
there was a strong sense of national gods.
Exactly.
The God of a people.
And
the reputation of the people rubbed off on their God and vice versa.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, verse 13 also includes this word power, which is going to become very important in our understanding of this passage, isn't it?
Yes.
By your power, you brought these people up from. So we're remembering the Exodus, the destruction of the Egyptian army, guiding them through the wilderness, military victory over the Amalekites down on their way to Sinai. So we associate power with these kinds of military and political developments. We're going to see that word power applied elsewhere in a fascinating way, but I wanted to highlight it here. The reference to, in verse 14, they have already heard that you, Yahweh, are with these people. there's that great promise, the Lord is with us, that Caleb and Joshua brought up earlier. And that you, Lord, have been seen face to face, that your cloud stays over them. In other words, you're present with them. Now, that statement, you have been seen face to face, kind of flies in the face, if I can say so, of other statements, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, yeah. It's sort of a truism. No person can ever see God and live.
Yeah.
That's a truism in the Bible.
And that was a very powerful reality at Sinai.
Yes. Yeah,
where the people were
absolutely.
to approach the mountain, but not too close. And
Right.
they weren't to look at God. They couldn't even see Moses' face
Right.
after he'd encountered God.
Yes.
And yet here we have a statement.
Yeah.
Is that a contradiction of some kind? How should we understand
Yeah,
that?
I don't think so. I think it just simply emphasizes the fact that the Lord God, Yahweh, was especially close to his people, and they had direct contact with these signs of his presence, like the cloud and the fire and so on. God was in their midst, and so they have an intimacy. I think that's the way I would describe face-to-face or eye-to-eye. They have an intimacy with their God that apparently is not shared by all other peoples and their gods.
Yeah. And then to return to this idea of the cloud that you've talked about so helpfully earlier, the cloud stays over them, the cloud goes before them. And so we have this image of the cloud, the presence of God, which is both a presence with and a guide for.
Right.
The cloud leads them and then hangs over them as a presence. In earlier verses, this idea of protection as shade was brought up. And the cloud gives shade. I guess the cloud also gives rain, but the clouds give shade, which was a very important commodity in this part of the world, right?
Absolutely.
When I think of protection, I think of protection from the sun. Not the sun. I think of protection from the rain or snow or sleet or hail or whatever. But in this part of the world, when you thought of protection, you thought of shade. Yes.
Absolutely.
You've been in that part of the world recently, haven't you?
Yeah, just returned from the Sinai Peninsula about a week ago.
Okay.
And I knew it was not a good look for me to be using an umbrella, but I really didn't care. It was a great help.
Because of the sun and the intense sun.
111 degrees
my
on
goodness.
Masada.
Well, I wish we had a photo of you. Do you have a photo of you with your umbrella?
I probably can scrounge one up.
We should be able to post that on our broadcast here. But okay, we'll just imagine it.
Okay.
We'll just imagine it. At any rate, Moses is saying, if you put these people to death, all these nations will say, oh my goodness, Yahweh wasn't able to bring these people into the promised land after all. He couldn't keep his oath. So here Moses is emphasizing the reputation of God, the reputation of the people of God, and I think, I want to say again, the ability of the Israelites to tell other people about the greatness of God and to convince them of that.
Yeah.
Well, it's in verse 17 now that he shifts gears to another argument, and here's where he goes to being our intercessor, their intercessor.
Yes, right.
Help us with that concept. What does it mean to be an intercessor or a mediator or something like that?
Well, in this particular case, the nation Israel are really not able to plead for themselves because they don't acknowledge and don't realize what they've done and the seriousness of their rejection. So the intercessor is someone who stands in and prays for them and stands between them and God and tries to pray for them. And he certainly does in this case. And it's really kind of when you think about it, it's really kind of an act of love because he's not treating the people the way they've treated him, right? This is an example of returning good for evil.
Yeah, they're plotting a stoning.
Yes.
And he's interceding in their
Right.
behalf.
Yeah.
It is really quite striking.
Yeah.
I wanted to point out that the word strength, early in verse 17, the Lord's strength, and that's the word Adonai, not Yahweh, is the very same word that was translated power back in verse 13.
Yes.
So there he was talking about God's power militarily and politically in effecting the Exodus and getting them to Sinai safely. Here he's using the very same word, but applying it to something completely different. What's our topic now?
Yeah, forgiveness, the power to forgive. And it really, I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that it takes great power to forgive. And Moses knows that and asks God to take his great power and to apply it to the task of forgiving these people.
It's really stunning. And he reminds us in this beautiful verse 18, which is quoted in the New Testament as well, the Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, and that's that covenant love, steadfast love, loving kindness, chesed, abounding in love and forgiving sin and rebellion, the word revolt. So he calls it what it is. And then later on, he highlights these characteristics of God and calls on God to do this hard work of forgiveness in accordance with your great chesed, covenant love. Forgive the sin of these people just as you've been pardoning them all along ever since they left Egypt. So here's the role of intercessor. Now, Moses was not the last intercessor in God's great plan of redemption.
No, not by any
Where else
means.
should we apply that concept?
Well, the author of the book of Hebrews, God only knows who that is, actually in chapter 4 discusses this account in the Old Testament, and talks about the rebellion of the people and how we need to make sure we're obedient and don't fall into their disobedience. But at the end of that, in chapter 4, he presents Jesus as our great high priest. We can have confidence and we can go before the throne of God boldly because he's there and he's ready to help us in our time of need. So it's Jesus.
Yeah, it is. And interestingly enough, Paul picks up on that intercessory role of our Lord and says that it should characterize our life of discipleship as well, and calls on us to participate in prayers of supplication and intercession in behalf of other people.
Sometimes we can intercede for people who are already praying, but in other cases, we're called upon to pray for others who, for one reason or other, cannot or will not pray for themselves.
As with Israel. Thanks so much for joining us. We pray that God's with you this week and that we all grow in our appreciation for the forgiveness of God and think for ways that we can intercede in behalf of others. Hope you'll join us next week. We'll see you then.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.